Truth in journalism and freedom of the press are under assault in our nation today, and sources for credible news are few and far between. Here's One America's Pearson Sharp with more on why the radical left is trying to silence independent news networks like OAN.
For over 10 years, One America News has been a beacon of truth in journalism. And for just as many years, we've been enemy number one for the deep state. Communists in Washington and the mainstream media have decided it's much safer to attack, deplatform, demonetize, and censor us than it is to maintain the freedom of the press. But ask yourself, do you really think they'd be censoring us if we were lying? If our reporting was actually fake news? No, they're censoring us because we're right. Which is why One America News is the only national news network you can turn to for the stories the mainstream media won't touch. So let's take a moment and go over some of these stories and imagine what our country, what world history could be like today if OAN wasn't censored and we had the same coverage as the corrupt legacy networks. A great place to start would be President Trump and the recent attempt to take his life. For years, we've covered the absolutely toxic attacks against Trump from Democrats and the media, and we've warned it could only lead to violence.
They're still going to have to go out and put a bullet in Donald Trump, and that's a fact.
In fact, just before the despicable shooter took aim at our commander-in-chief, I did a report exposing the Democrats and the media who were getting away with literally calling for President Trump to be assassinated. See the headlines for yourself. This is what passes for the mainstream in America. So the legacy news calls for Trump to be murdered. And what do you know? A few days after my report, a hateful Democrat brainwashed by Biden's putrid propaganda, tried to take the life of our president and nearly succeeded. Now, to reiterate, you could have watched the corporate news, which was openly encouraging someone to murder President Trump, or you could have watched OAN, where we tried to warn America about the Democrats' deadly agenda.
And he must be stopped. He cannot be president.
But assassination is just the tip of the iceberg and follows years of Democrats pushing theory after bogus conspiracy theory about Trump in a shameful effort to brainwash the American people and prevent him from ever taking office again. For example, how about the phony Russian collusion hoax? The major story of the century that got pushed by all the legacy networks and which OAN exposed as a totally fabricated lie. But the Russian collusion story was even worse because it was created by Trump's political opponent and was spread and propagated by the mainstream media who fed their lies to the American people for the sole purpose of railroading Trump's campaign. That's election interference, and we tried to stop it. We reported on Hillary Clinton's role in creating the Steele dossier, how her campaign literally spied on President Trump and how she paid a foreign agent to sabotage her political opponent with the help of the U.S. government. And then magically, she was able to convince the mainstream media that it was actually Trump who had done all those things. And they bought it. But not One America News. In fact, we interviewed Carter Page back in 2018, blowing the lid off Clinton's conspiracy to frame President Trump. One America News reported it, and the mainstream media covered it up. But then, on July 1st, 2024, the Supreme Court came out and proved us right again, overturning the Democrats' lies and ruling that President Trump has total immunity from official acts taken while in office. This destroys the Democrats' narrative that Trump obstructed justice, collaborated with foreign powers, and incited an insurrection. We covered the truth on those stories while the mainstream media promoted conspiracies. Again, How different would our nation be today if Americans were made aware of all of President Trump's accomplishments instead of being force-fed treachery and deceit every single day? Well, One America News steps in again. I put together an hour-long special documenting everything President Trump did for our nation and how he literally made America great again. Frankly, an hour was too short, but you get the point. No other national network out there would ever dedicate airtime to honoring Trump's service to our country, which is probably why we're in the situation we're in today. But our reporting on President Trump is just the beginning. One of the most divisive, controversial stories of our lifetimes has undoubtedly become the use of the dreaded COVID vaccines. Now, from the very start, I reported that there were a lot of questions about the efficacy of these vaccines, specifically after speaking with multiple doctors who warned about some of the side effects they were seeing firsthand in their patients. Side effects that were undeniable, unless you're a Democrat or in the mainstream media. This wasn't conspiracy. It was real-world evidence presented by doctors. Incredibly, at that time, you had the leftist radicals screeching, "We have to trust the science."
I trust the scientists.
I trust vaccines. I trust scientists.
The science determines what is the correct answer to a particular question.
I trust the science.
But when actual doctors doing actual science tried to warn everyone, saying, "Hang on a minute, this isn't adding up," those same leftists screamed, "No, not that science." So really, just the science that happens to agree with the authoritarians in Washington. Funny how that works. So of course, they denounced OAN and called us dangerous science deniers, which is so ironic, I'm not going to bother arguing with them. But in the end, big tech censored us. YouTube kicked us off their platform, and we were demonetized and deplatformed over my reports that quoted an actual doctor. Flash forward to today, after more than 3 years and millions of senseless deaths from the same toxic vaccines, who was proven right? On top of the countless scientists and frontline doctors warning about the dangers of the experimental vaccines, we now have massive lawsuits against the vaccine makers themselves, including one from the state of Kansas, which is suing Pfizer for misrepresenting their vaccine and the deadly adverse events it causes. Not to mention numerous studies, like this one out of Germany, that show the vaccine is not only totally ineffective, but that the number of people dying has skyrocketed since they started taking the vaccines. Didn't hear any of that on the mainstream media. We made countless reports about the unexplained deaths, the heart attacks, infertility, miscarriages, neurological disorders, the blood clots, the thousands of healthy young athletes collapsing on the field and dying for unknown reasons or sudden death syndrome. Imagine how many lives could have been saved if only more people had watched One America News. But they couldn't because we were censored by the government. And let's not forget what kicked off this catastrophe to begin with: the dreaded China virus. Now, there are two very different versions of how the last few years have played out. Since 2020, you could have suffered through the pandemic, terrified for your life as the mainstream media warned that this was it. This was the end of all life on Earth. If only those damn anti-vaccine Trumpers would get their shots. Now, that was one version of events. The other version is that you could have watched One America News, where you would have learned about the safe, proven treatments that have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine. medications the media claimed were for deworming horses, warning they will kill you.
It will kill you. I cannot stress enough. This will kill you.
Well, it won't kill you. That's a lie. And we were the only ones sharing this life-saving information, which is backed up by countless studies proving One America News was right all along. But that's not all, because while we were trying to save lives with ivermectin, former head of the CDC, Anthony Mengele Fauci, was not only calling for lockdowns and masks and social distancing based on nothing at all, but he was also pushing the toxic and deadly vaccines. To watch the mainstream media, you'd think he was the savior of science, Saint Fauci, a man who could do no wrong. The only problem is that he's actually a soulless psychopath who tortures dogs, carries out horrific experiments on black orphans, lies to Congress, promotes conspiracies, and denies the origins of COVID while trying to cover up his part in the lab leak that allowed the virus to escape in the first place. This man should be behind bars, or worse, for life. And while we covered his crimes against humanity, the mainstream media tried to cover them up. If America had been made aware of his crimes, just think of the pain and suffering we could have avoided. But our reporting on Fauci was denounced, just like the lab leak theory, which we exposed and reported on years before anyone else. OAN reported that this virus was genetically engineered in a Chinese lab funded by US tax dollars, overseen by Anthony Fauci. And we were ridiculed for our reports. Today, that story is a little different because all of our reporting has been proven true.
I think there's no doubt that NIH was funding gain-of-function research.
Is it likely that American tax dollars funded the gain-of-function research that created this virus?
I think it did, not only from NIH, but from the State Department, USAID, and from DOD.
Now let's switch gears and take a look back to 2018, when the world was rocked by news out of Syria that President Bashar al-Assad carried out a despicable attack against his own citizens using a deadly chemical attack to wipe out rebel fighters. The mainstream media covered the news in breathless horror, demanding swift and decisive action from the United States. The problem was that story wasn't true. None of it ever happened. You see, One America News went to Syria to investigate and uncover the truth. I personally visited Ground Zero. I talked to the citizens, the people living there. I went to the hospital and talked to the doctors and nurses. There was never any chemical attack. The story was totally made up by terrorists that were funded by the CIA to help overthrow the legitimate, democratically elected government of Syria. The deep state and Washington's warmongers once again pushing for illegal regime change, using terrorists and their puppets in the mainstream media to promote their lies. Well, OAN was there, and we proved them wrong. And in the years since then, the truth has come out about the staged chemical attacks and the terrorist group known as the White Helmets. But again, these stories were covered up by the mainstream media, and OAN was the only place you could find the truth. Today, that truth is more important than ever, especially when it comes to uncovering the Bidens, the modern America crime family. Where do we even begin? How about a story that we were again blasted for, but which again ended up being completely true? Hunter Biden's laptop. Now, the consequences of the cover-up and deception by the mainstream media cannot be overstated. Hunter's disgusting criminal activity was exposed to the world in a series of laptops that he carelessly forgot about, and the crimes revealed on his hard drives could have changed the outcome of the 2020 election. Many of the things that Biden was photographed doing, depraved sexual acts with hookers and what appear to be children, as well as his obvious drug use, were not only revolting, but illegal. This information and these horrifying images had been made public before the 2020 election. There's no way Joe Biden would have lasted long enough to steal the election and be installed in the White House. But when the images were released, the mainstream media came up with a phony story that they were somehow Russian disinformation. They weren't. They're all completely real. And all the so-called intelligence experts in various agencies like the FBI, who were trotted out to lie on camera about the validity of the hard drives, have all since backtracked and admitted that, yes, the laptops and the information they contain are completely legitimate. We reported that. From day one, we exposed the hard drives instead of suppressing the information in what is nothing less than the government overthrowing an election. But OAN was slammed for our reporting and denounced as conspiracy theorists. How different the world could be today if only the American public had known about the pervert they were supporting. Not that he was elected anyway, but Biden would have been a lot harder sell if Americans knew how big a criminal the deep state was propping up. Speaking of which, since the bellicose bag of bones finally shambled his way out of re-election, I think we deserve some credit for pointing out from day one that he was never fit for office to begin with. We were called right-wing wackos for claiming that he was mentally incompetent. That is, until all the bloviating Biden bots saw the last debate and realized, hey, maybe we were right. And of course, we can't forget about one of the biggest lies of all, the fake insurrection on January 6th. On that very day, OAN was front and center reporting that this was never a violent overthrow of the government. It was a peaceful gathering of protesters who were sick and tired of being lied to by the government. Well, despite our best efforts, we all got lied to again. And then, right before our eyes, the lie became the truth. And yet, contradicting all the Democrats' claims, no one was killed by protesters that day. Sadly, however, protesters were killed by police. There are still serious questions about Rosanne Boyland, a protester who died on January 6th, who was trampled in the crowd and then savagely beaten by officers as she lay helpless on the ground. Police officer Lila Morris was filmed viciously brutalizing the unconscious body of Rosanne Boyland before she died, though Morris has yet to face criminal charges for her actions. And we can't forget about Officer Michael Byrd, D.C.'s finest, who shot and killed an unarmed protester, Ashley Babbitt. Not only has he never faced any charges, since then, he's actually been promoted. And we also can't forget about Officer Brian Sicknick, who was tragically killed by a raging Trump protester bashing a fire extinguisher into his head.
Officer Brian Sicknick died after being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher during the hours-long attack.
They beat a Capitol police officer to death with a fire extinguisher.
Officer Brian Sicknick died after being hit in the head with a fire extinguisher during the fight.
He died at the age of 42 after he was bludgeoned with a fire extinguisher.
Yeah, that was all fake news. Brian Sicknick died of natural causes. In fact, the only reason people ever believe that Officer Sicknick was killed by Trump supporters in the first place is because the mainstream media lied about it. But OAN never did. We reported the truth, and as usual, we got blasted by the mainstream media. These are just a few of the innumerable examples where One America News reported the truth was demonized by Washington and the legacy news networks, and then later totally vindicated by the facts. Time and again, extremist, militant, left-wing news rags like Daily Beast, Media Matters, CNN, New York Times, and all the rest have attacked One America News for our reporting. They've published blatantly false headlines, lying about us, lying about our reporting, and lying about the news. And they're somehow held up and promoted by the left as champions of the truth, while we get censored. And when the facts eventually do come out, and OAN is proven right, well, there's never an apology or an admission that they were wrong. No, that's part of the narrative. They wouldn't dare admit that they were lying. Because for the left, it's not about reporting the news. It's about spreading the message. Are you starting to get the picture why the radical left is so desperate to censor OAN? These are stories which never would have been brought to light were it not for OAN's dedication to reporting the truth. If the American people knew what really happened, if they knew these stories and could decide for themselves, we'd still be on the air. Trump would have remained in office, and the last 4 years would have looked very different. This is why One America News is so crucial and what sets us apart from all the other news networks on air today. If you want to save our nation, now is the time. Because this is information warfare, and the only way to win is to make sure as many people are armed with the truth as possible. So call your cable provider, call AT&T, call Cox, call Comcast and Dish TV and DirecTV and Elon Musk and let them know what's happening. Demand that they carry OAN. And there might still be a chance we can turn this country around together. Although it may not be popular, the truth rarely is. We have never backed down or shied away from reporting the facts, even if we had to do it alone. For One America News, I'm Pearson Sharp.
For all our viewers asking where One America News is heading in the future, we would like to introduce you to OAN Live. OAN Live is the best way to stay up to date on all of the hard-hitting, straight-shooting, national and international headlines. And the best part is, OAN Live is only $4.99 per month. All the credible, honest, unbiased reporting One America News offers at a fraction of the cost of cable. Just go to OANN.com to easily sign up for OAN Live and stay informed.